Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we're building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish a season of 5 to 10 episodes every couple of months. This season is impact season. How can we manifest the meme of impact equals profit? What are the most interesting experiments and ideas in impact tracking? And how do we move from virtue signaling to crypto economic proof of virtue? These are the themes of Greenpill Impact Season in 2024. This season, we are allowing you to collect each episode as a NFT. If you go to pods.media/greenpill and find all the episodes and start collecting, you can collect this episode and other episodes from Greenpill Impact Season. My guests today on this episode are Eugene Leventhal and Mashal. I'm excited to talk to them because they wrote a report about the state of Web3 grants, basically looking at Web3 grants programs and how they are creating impact. So this is a broad peanut butter spread look at many different grants programs in the Web3 ecosystem and how are they doing in distributing capital to places where there is impact. So you can access the state of Web3 grants report using the links in the show notes. You can also access the Zora collectible associated with the state of Web3 grants in the link in the show notes. And I think that this is a really foundational episode because of the amount of research that has gone into it from Eugene and Mashal. I'm also joined by my co-host for Greenpill Impact Season, Carl, who is helping me pull out the major themes from the State of Web3 Grants report. So the State of Web3 Grants reports talks about the alignment of intentions and positioning for Web3 grants programs, how different Web3 grants programs are investing in operations for operating their grant program, a diversity in grant approaches. There's no single right way to run a Web3 grant programs, but there are some best practices that are starting to emerge. Transparency in grants programs. How can these grants programs become more transparent to the people who are applying to them? How are they governed? How do you govern the grants programs and make sure that they are on the right track? How do you build support systems for grantees? How do you address conflicts of interest and accountability? How do you build fairness and checks and balances? And how do you do impact reporting and assessment in Web3 grants programs are all themes of the Web3 grants report and this episode about the Web3 grants report. So I think that as we figure out how to connect impact to profit and how to do impact tracking, the state of Web3 grants report is a really good state of the coordination state of where things are now. And grants programs are such an important capital allocation mechanism that brings tens of millions of dollars to builders in the Web3 ecosystem. So this is a really germane episode because we talk so much about the capital allocation that's going on in Web3 grants and how to push the state of that forward. So I think that you're really going to enjoy this episode with Eugene and Mashal. Hey, Eugene. Hey, Mashal. How you doing?
Hey, pretty good.
Really excited to talk to you today about the state of Web3 grants report that y'all published. Can we start with some quick intros? Eugene, I'll start with you and then on to Mashal.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us and excited for the conversation. Intro-wise, I'm currently the interim executive director at MetaGov, which is a governance research nonprofit. I'm also a research lead at the Plurality Institute and helping to kick off a new proposer builder focused independent research foundation.
Sweet. Excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation. I'm Mashal, and I'm the head of ecosystem at Octant. We do governance experiments and have staked 100,000 ETH and are funding public goods rewards through that and having community decide where that funding goes. Started my research journey researching token models with Seed Club, moved on to QF research, and ventured down a grants funding path before joining hands with Eugene and doing this report.
Really excited to talk about this state of Web3 grants report that y'all put out. Could you tell me how you came to be working on this project and basically a high-level summary of the research you did?
Yeah, sure. Happy to get us kicked off there. So the idea kind of came up early last year where within MetaGov and DAOstar, there was already some energy picking up around creating a metadata standard, though as that project, for a variety of reasons, was losing a little bit of steam starting early summer, I was starting to think about, how can we do some more focused deep dives on different grant programs in the space? There were some examples like Sov's Compendium and some other resources here and there that would do kind of individual program deep dives. But there wasn't really anything taking sort of a more holistic view across grant programs and trying to get at least some baseline comparison. And so as we started talking to various folks in the space, Mashal and I got connected pretty early in the process, and we both just started geeking out on interest and excitement in exploring this. And we knew that this was not going to be the end all be all, capture every possible ounce of information relating to grant programs, but we did want to start with at least some kind of qualitative study and assessment of some history, current operations, how do people even think about their own impact, as sort of a foundational work for us to continue exploring it. And it's been really exciting to see, positive reception since then. We've been able to gather a bunch of grant operators and infrastructure providers. We're gearing up towards the Web3 Grant Summit in Denver. And within MetaGov, we've launched this sort of initiative called the Grant Innovation Lab to be a wrapper around the different research, technical work, and community work. And it seems like the grant community at large is really excited about it, which is fantastic.
Mashal, anything to add there?
No, I think you pretty much summed it up. I'd been on the grantee side of things, so just going through a lot of application processes and was just really confused about why there really wasn't enough around how these programs are running. There wasn't a lot of metrics shared, and it just kind of felt like grants were and still are a black hole for a lot of folks, right? So it just kind of made sense to, there was a lot of curiosity that went into it and just had a lot of questions going into it. And so talking to Eugene, it felt like we were just really curious about a lot of the same questions and wanted answers and wanted to help uncover this. So that's really what led to a lot of us working together on this.
Yeah, I guess if you were to explore some of the questions that you wanted to look at for each of the different ecosystems that you could include in the report, what were some of the main things that guided your research? What were some of the big questions that led you to certain ecosystems and certain explorations within those ecosystems?
Yeah, I think that as an initial starting point, it was just getting a basic understanding of like what the heck is going on across these grant programs. Even just trying to capture, what's the mission of your org, and is there a separate mission for your grant program, and how well are those articulated, and how easy are those to find? I know for some of them, we literally had people following up with us being, hey, you didn't catch the text that was in the Google search. Like, that's our mission. Like, well, why is it in your Google search and not on your website? That's kind of bananas. Like, why wouldn't you prominently host that somewhere? And so I think it was, at least for me, one of the motivating factors was just baseline knowledge. We can't have a real comparative discussion, at least until we have some basic information in the same format across, in this case, 13 programs. And I think we're going to get another 8 or so in the V2 that'll be hopefully launched in Feb to March timeline this year.
Yeah, and then it went from there to really being able to understand how they were operating, right? So we broke it down into the operations part. We looked at the review side. That was when we really wanted to explore, was understanding how the review process works, what that entails, what's used as a basis for even comparison between grantee applications from round to round. And because there were different programs, there were some legacy programs who had been there from the start of, I'd say, this industry as a whole, but then there were also a lot of iterations that happened. And so just being able to understand what the learnings from those were, and then finally how impact was being measured, evaluated, if at all. And yeah, those were a lot, and trying to find some form of similarity even around how these programs were working, because it felt like everyone was working in silos, right? So just being able to even get that same level of response from each program, that's quite a challenge for us.
I mentioned go ahead, Carl.
I think we might have been going to the same question here, which is probably around impact monitoring. And obviously the theme for the season is looking at how crypto is able to measure impact and what improvements it can offer over legacy systems. So I'd be curious if you could offer some hot takes on the current state of impact measurement in Web3. What are some of the things that are pretty abysmal, and where are some of the things where there's actually some pretty interesting innovation happening?
I'd say there were a lot of disappointments, because I guess like just going into it, we sort of, I don't know what I expected, but I think I expected something, right? And so one of the most shocking revelations from quite a few programs is that like there really isn't a lot of tracking happening, right? Let's forget evaluating impact. There's no tracking, there's no measurements. Most programs aren't even aware about grantees and whether in what their status is. I think we barely had like, I don't want to name them by name, but again, maybe like one or two programs who really were really on top of their game in terms of understanding where grantees in that ecosystem's at. And so that was one of the most shocking. Yeah, that was pretty shocking as a finding. And that really set the tone for us understanding what a lot of the issues were. And one theme we kept running into and we experienced is that almost every program is under-resourced right now. So it's not really out of not wanting to do it, but when there was one round after the others and there's just so much that's happening and there aren't enough resources like on the team and just on board, like you're going to focus on what the priorities are. And the priorities are running the next cycle of the next grant cycle. And so because of that, like it just feels like there's not been enough time to even absorb, reflect, and really think about that impact side. Of course, this isn't true for all programs. That was a pretty big one. That was pretty shocking. The other part being that for a lot of programs, there was a lot of hesitation to report what was happening. And part of it was because they weren't tracking a lot of these metrics. And it kind of felt like if there wasn't growth, they almost didn't want to share it. So the metrics they'd share from one update to another that's public facing would change, right? So if it's like a certain type of metrics, like that just kind of, again, almost felt like a PR exercise in ways, right? Like what's going to make us look really big and fancy and just like we're growing versus actually being able to be honest and being genuine. And I guess the business side of things is where, this dictates like why those decisions were made. But that was quite disappointing too.
And I think,
go ahead, Eugene.
No, I was just going to say, I think just building off of that, there was this kind of sense of, and I guess this isn't shocking for anyone who's been around Web3 for a while, but reinventing the wheel unnecessarily and not always looking to the relevant examples of where we can pull from. It felt like there were some parallels. I know for folks who were in DAO conversations in 2016, 17, 18, and you bring up word co-op and you get this kind of deer in headlights look a lot of the time of not being aware of all of the body of literature and relevant examples from that space. Here, as we were having these conversations and we bring up, hey, what's your theory of change? What is your actual desired impact? Your ecosystem growing is an outcome. It is not an impact. That outcome itself leads to impact, and there needs to be some more thought there. And that seemed to really be missing even from the more well thought out, really intentional programs that have spent a lot more time trying to codify their impact. And I know in some of the interviews, people just flat out said, we have no clue what good impact measurement metrics are. And we don't know where to start. We don't know how to improve. We got to start somewhere. That's why we have what we have. And that just very much felt like the underlying tone of a lot of the groups of not just having clarity of where to actually learn from here.
I think it's mind-blowing that some of these grants programs are spending millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars, and they have no clue how to measure impact.
Yep.
I wonder
that would be more priority.
I wonder if there's an opportunity for more. You all did such a great job of looking at a breadth of grants programs in this report. I wonder if there's an opportunity for cross-pollination from the best practices from some of the best grant programs to be cross-pollinated to other grants programs. And I'm mindful in pointing that out, that there's a diversity in grant program approaches. There's no single right way to run grant programs. Maybe there'll be several local maximos that people will approach in the grants ecosystems.
Yeah, and it's almost like I think we've really been trying to push that with a lot of our, I think every chance we get, and right from the start, it's just felt like getting everybody together in the same room and just really even just having a heart-to-heart, it's going to lead to a lot of learnings. But it feels like a lot more hearsay than actual action. Everyone wants to be part of something like that. No one wants to fund it. And that's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely exciting to see that there's at least interest in more coordination at this point. I think most grant operators see the value in at least hearing from other grant operators and knowing what's going on. I know there have been some attempts in the past of building community and shared calls and shared Telegram groups that have for different reasons kind of not achieve their intended goals. And maybe foolishly, but we are trying a V2 of some of these efforts to see if we can, as kind of a neutral research org, kind of be the ones to help pull together some of this, just to make people feel more comfortable that it's not a single for-profit entity driving the community. So maybe that was just one of the factors missing of, as soon as, company X organizes a community convening, everyone thinks like, what are they trying to get out of it? And, thinking of how does it unintentionally promote or support one ecosystem over another. So we'll see how those efforts pan out. But I definitely think there's, in a variety of capacities, not just for grants, but there's definitely more desire for learning and hearing from each other. And I think now there seem to be a number of efforts and initiatives to think, well, how do we actually share those learnings? If we have dense 1,000-page reports on every single program that no one's ever going to read, is that actually better than what we currently have? And so what is the in-between and the middle ground of, what other kind of reports? I remember when we were proposing the state of Web3 grants, Carl, you had suggested on the forum of, hey, think about a grant maturity scale as creating something like that feasible as part of that. And it wasn't just with the amount of resources we had, but it seems like there is more appetite for these more quantitatively driven frameworks, breaking out classification of, what is the goal of your grant program, right? If your goal is to support devs versus support community versus support the arts, you shouldn't be compared apples for apples directly. And so how do we as a space start segmenting appropriately, finding the right comparables, and from there figuring out interesting frameworks and suites of metrics and feedback loops? Because I think another big takeaway is that there is no mythical platonic ideal of the perfect impact measurement metric. And so figuring out what is the suite of metrics, what is the stream of data, and understanding what you have today might be different than what you have a year from now. And that's totally okay. I think just there's that kind of maturity happening right now, which is really exciting to see.
I was just going to add on. I mean, that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is also, it feels like there's a lot of appetite from the grantee side, where grantees want to understand how they can make their projects more sustainable. And so that was one of my biggest learnings from Shelling Point and Stumble last month, was just how many folks were on the grantee side of things and wanted to learn more and share more of those learnings and experiences. And it feels like there's appetite on both sides. And that feels like a really positive sign, and almost like the next step in iteration to what we want to build.
Yeah, just building on the theme that both of you mentioned of there being this like connective tissue among the grantees, and also bringing that back to what I'd imagine is the goal of most of these grants programs, which is to grow the ecosystem, to improve the health of the ecosystem, however you want to think about that. Like you said, it could be developer activity, it could be the size or the health of the community, it could be something more connected to, say, downstream impact on arts or others. And so I'm curious if you saw any examples of ecosystems or grant programs going beyond just sharing learnings, but also trying to encourage projects to build off each other and collaborate in different ways. Because one of the things which is so powerful, and we're able to see this with some of the data that we're collecting in Open Source Observer, is that many projects actually have shared contributors. There could be a person who's working on MetaGov, and the same person's also working on DAOstar, and the same person's also contributing to Gitcoin. And by having a finger in all these different projects, you actually have an interest in all of them succeeding and doing much more than just focusing on optimizing your own project success.
Yeah, I definitely think that there were a number of programs that, and we just called this more grantee support, and what kind of support structures are in place. Pretty much upon signing the grant and confirming the fund issuance, is that kind of it? Do you just say, great, thanks, we'll see you at your next milestone? Or is there a consistent structure to follow up with the grantees to say, hey, Project X, we actually just funded Project Y, where there's some great synergies between the two of you two. You should definitely talk and get to know each other at the very least. So there are definitely a number of programs that I know I'm just thinking of, like Aave and Uniswap Foundation, of two off the top of my head, that definitely dedicate time and energy. And that it's an operational overhead. And I think that's also an important thing to call out for anyone who's structuring or running grant programs. That does cost time and money and energy, but it pays itself in a lot of long-term rewards and impact, because you can actually maximize having a cohesive strategy across all of your granting, as opposed to a lot of isolated projects. And to your point, Carl, like just the nature of the Web3 space, there are very few people who are just wearing a single hat in this space at the moment. So just recognizing who is where and using that as a strength and encouraging more coordination and collaboration can actually be really positive for everyone, instead of trying to overly segment. But at least from my perspective, Mashal, I don't know if you would agree with this take, but it felt that the groups that weren't doing it, it's not that they didn't want to, it's that they were either resource constrained or didn't put it into budgeting, or just had some kind of operational logistical element to it, as opposed to ideological desire to not do it.
No, 100%. I'd agree with that. I'd also mention the Ethereum Foundation's ESP, the support program that they've got. They've done a really good job of getting different grantees together, and they have different community calls that they organize. And the whole point of that is one, amplification and connecting different projects together. But there's a lot of different opportunities that they put into just their regular programming. And that was a really good forum. And then just in different ways and indirect ways, really connecting one project to another where it makes sense. So it feels like it's almost like the different teams that are within almost sort of take on that responsibility and help with that. Yeah, but this was one of those really key. I think what you've touched on is it's a really key area. Like this was a sentiment that a lot of grantees really want support with, is the amplification and the partner support, because it's really valuable and just support beyond financial support. It's not just about getting the grant funding. There's just so many more elements that they want support with that we've been having conversations around. And then the other part of it being financial stability and just roadmap planning. And that feels like a really, really important part too, where a lot of grantees are able to get funding for like a short amount of time, but then how do you make that sustainable? How do you make your project survive, right? And it feels like there's a lot of programs for startups and founders and builders, but not enough for grantees in specific. So I think that's probably a growth area for programs to collaborate on and hopefully work on.
One of the things which is really interesting is when grants programs actually have eligibility requirements around working in public and sharing things either in the form of open source code or other artifacts that can be easily accessed, reproduced, and used without permission. So I'm curious if you came across any examples of grants programs that were actually able to change some of the incentives for how people build in their ecosystem just by using the carrot of having certain eligibility conditions come along with the grant funding. It's okay if the answer is no, people are still experimenting with it, but I see that as potentially like a powerful way of trying to force people to collaborate by making them do everything out in the open and build in public.
Yeah, it felt like there's definitely a spectrum in terms of, I would say, absolute hard requirement. We're just not even considering you. If not, that degree of it is probably more limited than at least strongly encouraged. Mm-hmm. And I think more looking on an ad hoc basis of, is there really a good reason to not do it publicly? It seems like more L1 focused projects. So I know like Ethereum and Solana were very big on pushing that. I'm pretty sure Solana has like very explicit language, if I'm remembering correctly, around like you must be public good, open for the public, at least for our ecosystem, which at that point it means for everyone effectively. And yeah, I think, there were some other ones. I know like Uniswap, I believe, also has that explicit public good language. But at the same time, some of these groups do in isolation run specific focused grant programs that are intended to have a pretty much invite-only RFPs or requests for proposals, where you're saying that, hey, given the nature of the grant that we're putting out, we know that most groups are not going to be able to deliver on this because you need massive network infrastructure, you need certain type of talent on board already. This isn't meant to be building a new team. It's a group that is already able to execute on this. So I think there are definitely caveats and exceptions across the board, I think. But yeah, there were definitely some that had reasonably strong language in that direction.
I'm wondering if you can tell me where things you think are going in 2024. So you mentioned that there's another report coming down the pike. What are some trends that are going on in the ecosystem that, if I offered you the opportunity to speculate a little bit, where do you think things are going?
I'd say retro has been a big focus area. Everyone's been talking about it, just retroactive funding. And so that's one where we definitely see a lot more programs shifting towards and experimenting with. So of course, optimism's been pretty, I'd say pretty big in terms of really getting that going. But we foresee a lot more programs really testing that out. And there's a lot more talk, but it feels like not enough programs who understand really how to go about it. So the mechanism side of it is still something that's going to be tested out. And that's something we're going to be, I don't know, can we talk about that? Just like the East Denver side of things, or just our report?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Just like, I guess first update and everybody gets to hear about it here first, but we're doing a retro report where we're covering programs, tools, and just covering that side of things. So we're just actually making it a reality, and we're going to be talking about it and sharing it during ETH Denver.
Oh, sorry, mute issues. And just to build off of that, so there's definitely, we already have some of the work of the state of V2 of the grant report. We have the retro case study looking at least 3 orgs, and we'll hopefully find some more backers to be able to extend that. I think it's interesting where it feels like for retro, at least this is totally my view, so this is not meant to be anyone else's, but, I think there's a rush to retro right now, at least ideologically, because on the surface, it seems like, oh, great, then we don't have to figure out metrics up front. Like, we will see that you have done stuff. Not recognizing, talk to anyone at Optimism who's been there from Retro PGF 1 to 3, and you will hear a lot of discussions and talk about we need better infrastructure, we need more robust systems, more data capture, more thinking about how to capture the qualitative side of things, and recognizing your constraints and the fact that you're not going to solve all of those problems, especially if you're trying to rush to a grant program in a month or two. So I think that similar how there were a number of grant programs through the last boom and bust cycle, or bull and bear, however you want to call it, that groups just rushed to launch a grant program, and then afterwards being like, why did I spend millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions in dollars on question mark impact? I think there's going to be the same rush to retro for some groups who don't realize the robust infrastructure and thinking that is needed, and are just going to be dissatisfied of, I thought this was going to solve our metric problem, and it didn't magically just make that problem go away. It just reframed it a little bit. So I think there's genuine interest towards retro from people who get this at a more nuanced level. I guess a hot take might be a bunch of groups, or not a bunch, but at least a handful of groups will start a retro program and then sunset it within a year or so because they just realize they got into more than that they were ready to chew off. But I think some other guesses for next year, and I know prediction is always a fool's errand, so please don't roast me too hard when most of this ends up being wrong somehow. But I think there's going to be more of a push of private foundations, for the biggest problems that we're facing as a space, technical challenges, let's just take ZK or MEV proposer builder separation, or even some governance related challenges. Most groups are dealing with them. So if everyone has an isolated program targeting those questions, they just will not be as impactful as running coordinated foundations in addition to some kind of individual level support. So I know I'm involved in one of these foundations. I believe I'm not directly involved. I believe there's a second separate one on the ZK side that's happening with 4 or 5 different groups coming together that I've heard whispers about. So my guess is that there will be kind of anywhere in the 2 to 5 private foundations or projects or initiatives. They'll have different names, and I don't know if all of them will have legal entities, but some kind of coordinated fundraising. And I really hope that there will be more focused theories of change workshops, mission vision for your grant program type workshops, and just more consistent discussions along those lines. Because to understand your impact, you really need to understand the value of, you have funding, you're encouraging people to do certain activities. What do you hope to result from those activities, from those outcomes and outputs? What kind of impact do you want to see that having in the long run? And having just much more nuanced and robust discussions in that direction. So hopefully that means there will be an uptick in groups that are doing facilitation work. And I know there are a lot of great groups in the space doing that kind of work. And I hope that that will bode well for everyone in that sense. I think as a result of that, we're just going to have many more shameless kick at the cans of hey, I don't know if these are the best impact metrics, but I'm trying them out, because why just have the same boring ones that everyone else is doing? where we know no one's happy with that outcome. So yeah, I think more experimentation on the impact measurement side, especially as groups like OS Observer that Carl and Ray are running, and HyperCert and Karma and their GAP tool, the grantee accountability tool. I think just the tooling infrastructure is much more robust now than it was a year or two ago for impact measurement. So I'm just super excited to kind of observe it, hopefully collaborate with all the groups that are trying to build the open source infrastructure side, and just see how we can help each other make sense of a very hard and open-ended space.
One thing I'd add on to that would be the marketing side. I think a lot more, there's going to be a lot more of marketing and grants teams working together, because it feels like, especially in this space, like running a grants program or any grant funding announcement seems to echo a lot of marketing and awareness and just builders, and just kind of builds the ecosystem in a lot of ways. And so we're moving towards seeing a lot more programs mature, but I think for a lot of the newer protocols or layer twos or whatever you want to call it, I think they're realizing the value of just grant programs as a whole, and from a marketing perspective and community perspective, more importantly. So I'd say we're going to see a lot more of all three meshed together in ways. And I think that changes a lot of organizational structures as well. And hopefully gets programs more resourced in ways, right? Because once the marketing folks come in, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way in any way, I'm a marketing person through and through, but we're just going to bring a lot more resources, and we're going to see that happen. It's and see that trickle down.
Yeah, one of the things that I know that Kevin has said a number of times that I've also observed is that if you take Gitcoin, for instance, every quarter they run a grants round, and they've now done 19 Gitcoin grants, and every Gitcoin grants includes many sub-rounds as well. So you have all these experiments that are happening. And one of the things which I think is really admirable is that each time they're just modulating on one or two of the variables. So they are changing the composition of projects, or they're changing the way that civil activity is identified and hopefully suppressed. And so because of that, they're learning really, really quickly. They're not trying something, deciding it didn't work, throwing it out, picking up something new, trying that, but they're actually steadily iterating on something. And so my hope certainly would be that programs that are going to be doing much more experimentation, they actually start creating that heartbeat of doing these regular rounds. And even when they take one or two steps back, they actually take the time to learn, improve a few things, and go back out and do it again. And so, again, Gitcoin has made many mistakes. I'm sure Kevin can speak to those, or has written many articles about them. But the fact that they don't make the same mistake twice, they're quick to learn from it, is one of the things which is really impressive about the space, and hopefully will give it an advantage long term. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kevin.
I think that yes, and that's the model that I'd like to see replicate, especially knowing that many of these other grants programs out there have started out with underinvesting in their operations, or having no idea what kind of impact they're even trying to measure. Just this protopian view in which we run rounds on a regular basis and we try to iterate and improve every round gives a path towards not redemption, but just getting better, finding that local maxima of what your grant program can be. And, that doesn't paint the whole picture, because I think that a lot of these ecosystems will have many different types of grants programs. My vision is that there'll be regular plain vanilla grants, and then there'll be retro PGF, and then there'll be QF, and there'll be like a whole bunch of different Legos that you can assemble to build your grant program in the next cycle, as opposed to just like the marketing team being like, oh, we need a grant program, let's, I guess, make something up in Airtable. I think that that's one of the maturations that we see happening at Gitcoin. But I don't have a question, but if anyone wants to riff on that, they're welcome to. If not, I can go back to asking questions.
Well, I'd say on the running a grant side, like I feel like it's also because the tools that we have now versus when, say 2-3 years from now, like grant, I just ran this SheFi Octane round on GrantStack, and it was so easy. I didn't need any dev support on that front. It was just took I'd say 10 minutes at most. And so all that to say that it's becoming a lot easier to run grants and just directly connect with the communities. And so I think from that perspective, once you can make that accessible, and then another thing that we're realizing is that you don't need big chunks of funding, even if you've got smaller pools, right? So funneling, even the reason I said marketing and grants together, you're better off running your ad budget, which I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts on Twitter ads in general, but if you ran that and turned that into a grant round or like a small grants round, like I feel like that's just a lot more effective for you if you're in the space, and especially if you're in PGF. And so experiments like that, which don't take a lot of effort and time and resources, and can still lead to a lot of results. So I think that's going to be another thing.
Yeah, just one kind of final thought on that, I guess, is I think it's a great aspiration to make your grants program so simple that it's almost boring. And yesterday, I overheard a quip which was saying that Gitcoin, that's just like a simple grants program. When 2 or 3 years ago, trying to explain the notion of quadratic funding on Gitcoin, you couldn't do it. It would just it would blow people's minds. And now that being seen as like vanilla grants making, I think is just testament to all of the improvements that have been made, not only in the UX, but in just exposing people to this concept in this way of funding things. So my hope would be that more things kind of cross over the chasm and become completely normalized and seen as just the way that Web3 grant making happens. And hopefully that is true for Web3 PGF. Hopefully that's true for other forms of donating and supporting projects. But it's a cool aspiration to have.
Yeah, and just to pick up the thread with sort of the experimentation and some of the other things that were just mentioned, and coming back to the idea of experimenting on the impact measurement side and the sort of feedback loops from that, I know I've spoken to folks in kind of the nonprofit impact evaluation space, and I was catching up with someone who specifically her organization focuses on getting funding to rural farmers in a number of countries. I think the example she was providing was in Uganda. And she was saying that, as we really ironed out our focus and desired impact, we spent a lot of time with those communities. And so I think it's going to take some time and experimentation, and it is okay to be wrong in your first attempts at this as you build out these feedback loops. Because if you're growing Ethereum or you're growing Uniswap or you're growing Aave and your grant program is meant to help that, it isn't necessarily clear who is the audience that you are going towards to understand how the impact is going for them, because that might, right, if you go to all the early adopters, that has its own bias in terms of diversity and spread and who's actually involved. And so actually getting to spend more time with what is the type of impact you want to see in the world, who will stand to benefit from that, and how do you develop relationships with those folks and nurture that over time? Because if you want, especially if you're an L1 or an L2 or a core protocol, and your desired use is that like, hey, we're the baseline for the global financial system for your grandma or your grandpa to be able to send a transaction around the world or do something like that, then we actually have to get closer to those audiences and understanding how they are experiencing this world. And that feels very distant from where we're at, because even just getting feedback from like the degens hanging around the projects can be tough. So getting to the point of many steps out with communities that are less aware of it, for whom Web3 is a dirty, scammy word at this point, it's going to take a lot of time and effort. And yeah, I guess just to plug some more Gitcoin stuff, it is just really cool seeing that, I show up at a number of impact-oriented or funding-oriented conversations in the Web2 space, and one of the few positive examples is, look at Gitcoin experimenting. Like, that's cool. Should we be learning from that in terms of how we do some things? And so we need more groups that are willing to spend the time and energy to nurture that positive juju, especially in the face of, it would be great if we have no more scams. I'm guessing 2024 is not going to be a scam-free year for crypto. So yeah, for those who really are more regen and truly impact focused, we have to think about without plugging Web3 or blockchains, how do we just focus on positive impact that people can care about and build those relationships over time?
Reputation damage, right? Just we're taking on that whole burden for the industry.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're getting towards the bottom of the hour, so I think we should start moving towards wrapping up. But before I get to my wrap-up questions, I did want to ask if we could pinch and zoom a little bit more on this grant standard that y'all published. It's not really a focus of the grants report, but I do want to make sure that we cover it while we have you. So tell me all about the MetaGov grant standard that y'all have been cranking on.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share about that. So, as mentioned, we released DAO IP DAO Improvement Proposal 5, which is just the DAO Star language around these standards that we're working on, including some just general interoperability standards between DAOs and different Web3 orgs. And just for clarity, for a moment's sake, DAO Star is an initiative under MetaGov. That's our specific Web3 work, because MetaGov as an org looks at governance in digital communities, not exclusive to the Web3 space. So, the focus of this metadata standard is really making it, or the attempt at trying to create a standardized structure for how we refer to and call certain variables that are just part of grant programs, such as a standard field for name of program, for name of project, for funding ask amount. And right now, we are going through a feedback phase with having discussions with a lot of different groups that include both grant operators as well as infrastructure providers like the Gitcoin Allo team, like Questbook, like Charmverse, and some of these other groups that are sort of providing, and the Gitcoin Stack team and the others that are doing the actual technical infrastructure for executing grants. And even if we do create the most perfectest standard possible, it is highly unlikely that everyone will adopt it, because especially the groups that have been around forever, or at least as far as the space is concerned, they're going to have less incentive to conform, especially if they are not necessarily pushing to publicly share their data, which is the case for some of the longest standing grant programs. So the goal is not sort of to try to create some master layout that everyone must buy into or else it's all bust. The goal really is to try to figure out, for the groups that do want to opt into more interoperability and more coordination, at least on a technical side between programs, how can we enable that with a standard? And some of the immediate benefits that we've had excitement about in terms of what comes after the standard if it gets adopted is we can have a single shared database of all approved grants across the space. And then we can really start having much more nuanced analysis that doesn't involve spending dozens of hours combing different spreadsheets and forums and putting together your own database. It can just exist and be available and be public for everyone to see that data. And especially if that gets integrated with tools like OS Observer, with Karma's Gap, with these other protocols that are capturing data and elucidating how we think about impact and getting feedback on the projects over time, that can become a really tight feedback loop to help us understand how to better measure impact, which that's one of the big hopes. And then I know one of the other potential projects is the idea of a common app for grants. So how can we have a potential open source protocol that can integrate with any tooling, so that if I, as the person for MetaGov, am applying for, say, a 100K grant for some work that we want to do, I can immediately signal that, hey, I have a 100K ask that I'm splitting across 10 groups. Everyone has that transparency on it. So you don't know, am I asking Gitcoin one amount and asking another group another amount? And, you'll have that transparency and ease for the grantee to not have to go through, 10 different portals to start off and just copy paste most of the same information. And at the same time, a hopeful benefit for operators is to actually start capturing reputation of grantees across grant programs. If I just show up at Uniswap and you can see that I've delivered on grants at Aave and Ethereum and et cetera, that can potentially be part of assessing my new grant application, as opposed to if I just show up and I have, I've burned bridges everywhere I've been, then you should also factor that in and know that I'm probably here to grant farm and just capture whatever your first milestone is and then never show up again. Those are some of the hopefully intended projects. And in Denver, we are going to have a working session specifically focused on trying to drive this forward. And we're going to have a number of virtual calls in January. So if that's something you're specifically interested in, please do reach out.
Thanks, Eugene. Carl, you want to take the next question?
One of the projects that we've also been following quite closely is the Ethereum Attestation service. And what's interesting about that is they basically take any arbitrary schema and you can make an on-chain attestation using that schema. So when I think about the grant standard, one way of looking at that would be, instead of getting every ecosystem to use that entire standard and have every project try to fill out every field, many of which might not be applicable or might not be suitable to what they're doing. And at the same time, there might be other things that they want to add that aren't well captured there. Another approach could actually be to use something like EAS to represent a grant as effectively a series of attestations. So it could be there's a set of attestations which plug in for an open source software project. And there's another set of attestations that plug in if you're doing some kind of event management where you want to track participants in real world attendance. I think with something like that, you kind of have the best of both worlds where there's a common standard, which gives you guidance about how to think about each of these schemas and how they relate to each other. But at the same time, you give each grant program the flexibility to mix and match the parts that are most suitable for them.
For sure. And I appreciate you very clearly elucidating the thing we're going to focus on after we get the initial phase of feedback, because we recognize that the grant standard is not going to be perfect for everyone, and nor do we want to force conformity for groups that it doesn't make sense. So we feel step one is see how much interest and alignment is there for a grant standard, right? Everyone can come back to us and say, hey, we're just never going to align, optimism attestations are just going to be fundamentally different than Gitcoin allos versus et cetera, in which case we just have to go to that modular approach that you just mentioned. But our hope is, as you brought up, that it can be hybrid, that, maybe we can have 60% of the grant programs in the space conform with the data standard. So we could set up easy scraping and feeding into certain shared data structures. And then for everyone else, hey, here's a proposed version of doing some kind of EAS enabled patchwork of attestation. And that space will offer not endless, but we'll offer a lot of experimentation, and we're not going to know the best way to do it. We're going to be really excited to see different attempts and experiments in that direction. And yeah, I know at DAOstar, we already work with EAS crew in a couple of capacities. So definitely going to coordinate with that, with them in the new year, or this year, excuse me.
Well, we're getting towards the bottom of the hour. I have one wrap-up question for you all, and that's, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say? Mashal, I'll go to you first.
It's a good question, and I'm thinking. I guess one thing that I would love to share is, I think, and this is sort of shout out to like Ave Grants DAO. One thing I'd love to see from more programs would be more transparency around sharing internal metrics and, of course, like where their grantees are at. It's going to lead to a lot more transparency towards, and it just for the communities as a whole, but also just understanding where we're at in terms of the space. Just if, smaller pipelines or numbers growing is not a sign of failure, and should not reflect on the team as a performance failure as a whole, right? I think there's just different like fluctuation points with each grant cycle. So just being cognizant of that. And I mention them because they've been doing these monthly updates on their forums, and those have been really helpful for everyone in the community to understand. So I think that's like a good model to look at for any community that's trying to really go for sharing more of what's happening. And yeah, that was one that I really did appreciate. And then I'd say shout out to the EF for taking on risks. A lot of the projects and just funding, while a lot of programs are very focused on growing their ecosystem, I'd say like they've also had the luxury of focusing on and taking on more risks with projects other programs wouldn't want to fund. And so that's something I've appreciated. I was part of summer protocols where we were studying protocols in the summer. And that was the kind of program I wouldn't see other maybe orgs supporting or financially funding, right? So it would be really, really cool to see other programs taking on risks for projects that, sort of are open-ended and we don't know where they're going to go. But this is also my other part where, not to go off into a rant, but like, we focus so much on metrics and there's so much that you also can't quantify. As on the grantee side, if you're part of a project where you haven't you're still impacting people and they remember your name, but there's no form of quantification that's happened there, right? Maybe they're not subscribed to your newsletters anymore or to your socials or whatever metrics or numbers, you're thinking about, but you were their entry point into the space. That's something they're always going to remember. And those are the kinds of things that maybe we're not thinking about as much. I worry that as we kind of hyperfixate on numbers, there's a lot more on the qualitative end. And even in terms of industry growth that we're not thinking about. And I would hope that we'd be more open-ended and a little more flexible in how we think about a lot of these things, especially as we see these programs mature. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents at the end.
Thanks, Mashal. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but I've asked Eugene to go first a couple times, so I wanted to give you the opportunity too. Eugene, same question to you. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
Yeah, I guess maybe one question could be, who should we publicly shame as far as grant? No, I'm just kidding. I think to just build off of what Mashal was saying, I think an important area for experimentation and focus in the coming year is also really focusing on the grantee experience, because to better understand the qualitative, to better understand the impact, to better understand a lot of the threads that we've been talking about, just talk more to grantees and sometimes even bring in third parties to get honest feedback from them, because it can be intimidating telling the person that's signing your check for grantee that's giving you a window of life as a project to be like, actually, I think you're really messing up in a lot of places. So I think finding the right ways to source feedback, whether anonymously or through facilitated interactions, or just like, hey, here's a hall with Post-it notes at a big conference, and just like, come give us your Post-it notes of complaints with how we're doing, whatever version it is, just listen more to your grantees.
Amen to that.
Carl, you're my co-host, so I don't know if it's in bounds to ask you a question, but is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say as we close out the episode?
I just want to say I'm so grateful for this kind of work. I think it's really, I always like it when people start with some kind of question that occupies their curiosity and they explore it, and that leads to something which they can share with the broader community to further their thinking. So thank you for having that itch and scratching it and sharing it with the rest of us. It's really cool.
Samesies, yeah. You guys are building a public good for the public goods ecosystem. So it's like a meta public good, which I guess is appropriate because it's MetaGov that you're working out of.
Love keeping it meta.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thanks so much. The link to the Web3 Grants Report is in the show notes for the episode. We also will have a link to the MetaGov grant standard in there as well. So thanks so much for coming on the Greenpill podcast, and keep up the great work in 2024.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you all for hosting us.
You just heard from Eugene and Mashal. I'm excited about them because I think that they did a ton of research going into the State of Web3 Grants Report, and it's a really foundational knowledge building block for the ecosystem to know about the state of Web3 grants today and where they're going in the future. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. Again, this podcast features the people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. I think Eugene, Mashal, and Carl are a great example of that. If you enjoyed this episode or you value our work, you can go to pods.media to collect this episode. And please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps us build this movement of regenerative crypto economics and push it forward in the world. Thanks again for listening. Peace and love. See you on the next one.